Hey, it's Kaneki, and this is my YouTube channel. But this isn't YouTube. We got a YouTube, baby! Woo! Look at that. We got the LED. We got something sparkly for the kids. We got the palm trees over here. This is gonna be great. Anyways, I've been a professional artist for about 13 years now. I do miniatures, I do giant murals and everything in between. So come with me, we're gonna make some builds, we're gonna do some cool stuff, and I'm gonna show it to you. I've always been interested in sharing a little bit more about the process. And guess what? YouTube already decided I was worth a plaque. That's right, baby. Cardboard, 1 subscribers. And Mom, I'll see you at dinner on Sunday. So come with me, we're gonna build some stuff. When I sat down at my studio desk in San Diego, I really had no clue what I was gonna build. I had this cool glass dome and the idea to put an old vintage Gogi retro sign letter inside of it, kind of floating in a desert landscape. After poking around online for a bit, I found the old Stardust sign from Vegas. I absolutely fell in love with the letter A, so I chose to use that in the concept. I added a Sonora cactus to offset the composition and was really happy with the design. So it was ready to build. Booyah. The design called for 3 circles, so I traced the glass dome on some old pieces of 1/2-inch plywood and cut them out on my bandsaw. I exchanged some fresh sandpaper before finishing off the circles on the disc sander. I cut a hole in one of the circles, which will act as the bottom of the base. I measured the interior of the glass dome and cut a corresponding circle from 16th inch MDF on my scroll saw. However, when I went to test the fit, it was a bit too small. So I redid the measurements in millimeters and had a much better result. Even though I'm a US boy, I tend to use millimeters when I'm working in miniatures as it's far easier to understand and far more precise. Then it was off to the chop saw to create some small legs to separate the layers of the base. I glued and assembled these with the finishing nail gun. Once I had the shape of my base, I created a cardboard template of the letter A in order to ensure proper positioning and fit. Remember, it's much easier to make a mistake in cardboard than to put hours into a real thing and have to toss it out. And because I needed precision in this build, I decided to design the letters in Illustrator and plot all of the holes for the LEDs. I sent those to my laser and cut them out of 16th inch plywood. When I went to do a test fit, I found out that the LEDs weren't popping through enough, and I really wanted that Vegas letter sign quality. So I took my pilot bit on the backside and bored out a little bit of a hole so they'd protrude further. I want the letter to resemble sheet metal, so I cut some paper forms that overlap perfectly. I also cut a series of 1mm circles that I can easily collect on tape for painting. These will be used later as tiny rivets in the sign. Once the test fit was complete, it was time for paint. Nah, you probably shouldn't be painting indoors, but I have an air scrubber, a vent, and I wear a mask, so it is what it is. I create the rust texture with a series of orange and brown paints, slowly sponged and dry brushed on. Sometimes I water down the paint a bit and let it evaporate, creating unique swirling patterns. I airbrush the rust around each individual hole and the edges where I would perceive the most wear and tear in the real world would be. With the painting complete, it's on to the complicated part, the wiring. So before we get into all that, let me tell you a little bit about this piece. This is kind of the inspiration, the first successful time that I was able to create this technique. This is entitled Twinkle Twinkle. I made it a little while ago. It's the facade of a motel with a bunch of these 100 or so LEDs popping through and shining. And when I first started hooking them up, I didn't do any testing like a ding dong. I just started attaching them and soldering in the back. I did the first 10. Tested it to see if it was working. I realized I'd grabbed from the wrong pack of LEDs and I'd used flashing lights. I was heartbroken for a moment until I realized that they all are flashing at slightly different pulse rates. And so they're making a little twinkle effect. So guys, keep in mind, art can come from any sort of happy accident, wherever inspiration comes from. You might even make a mistake and then make something beautiful. On the back side of the letter, I designed a parallel circuit. The black line represents a positive wire, and the purple represents a negative. I laid them out in a spiral pattern, and then orient my LEDs so that the positive lead faces the appropriate side. If there's enough interest, I could make a more detailed video on this process. Remember kids, it's smart to test all your LEDs in a breadboard before you use them. Once satisfied, I glue them in with tacky glue and let that fully dry before I move on to the wiring. By far the most delicate part of this process was laying in the non-coated copper wiring in between all of the little LEDs, and then bending all the leads over so that you could solder them properly. This was a highly repetitive and tedious process that took me about 3 hours. However, all of that work was quickly forgotten as soon as I was able to look at the final result. With the structure of the letter assembled, I added the paneling and fixed it in place with spray adhesive. With a small brush, I added some glue, then placed all the individual rivets. This is another time-consuming process, but really adds an extra layer of detail and realism. I created the exterior of the signage with a piece of heavyweight paper. To ensure my bends are 90 degrees, I utilized a straight edge. I just followed the letter form, finding every little crease and turn, then glued the pieces of paper into place. And here is the result. All right, let's do a little mid-build check-in. I've just completed this letter. It looks fantastic. That's gonna go onto this base, and then of course the dome is gonna go on top. Now, what else do I have to do? I've gotta create a cactus, maybe some other desert detritus to kind of put around this thing and make it look like an actual real lived-in world. So let's get back to the build. I designed my three-dimensional elements in Procreate using my iPad. I always use plenty of reference images to ensure that things come out as real as possible. But at the end of the day, it's an organic shape, so it's kind of just like having fun and making it work for you. The cactus was tall enough that it required use of the big boy. I'm talking the Anycubic Photon M3 Max. I only bring it out for special occasions, and YouTube, you're one of them. This print took something like 23 hours, so I just left it overnight and came back the next day. To create the texture of the desert sand, I used my hot wire to cut some 1-inch foam. After breaking and restringing the wire, I decided to slowly drag it across and kind of got that desired effect. I did it a few times until I was happy with the result. I cut away the foam with an X-Acto knife so the letter would appear to be sinking in the desert sand. I painted the rim of the landscaping black and burnt sienna underneath the sand. After an unfortunately thick coat of scenic cement, I sprinkled the desert sand on top. This takes about 24 hours to dry, and it was the last thing I did before I went home for the night, so I might have been a little bit sleepy and a little bit less detailed than I would have liked. For the on-off switch, I decided against a visible standard on and off switch. I wanted to create something more seamless. So I used a nail that will pass through some tubing to depress an electrical switch hidden inside the piece. I cut a couple of pieces of plywood to create the base for the switch. I hot glued it into place, then used the solder to melt an opening in the switch that will fit the head of a nail. At this point, I realized my original design was not going to work, and that a multi-layered system would make it impossible for any sort of future repairs, so I decided to break off the little feet and remove the center layer. I recut some new legs and tacked them into place. I made a paper template to get the correct size for the exterior of the base. For this, I chose 32 gauge steel and transferred the measurements from my template. I clamped it down and gave it a cut with my angle grinder. You may notice that I've taken off all the guards and protection on most of my tools, and that sometimes I like to make a cut with my non-dominant hand. So here's where they say, don't do this at home. After cutting, I ground down the edges to make it nice and smooth before finishing touches on the grinding wheel. Then it was off for a little spray paint. After transferring the marks from my template, I pre-drilled holes in the metal and did a quick alignment check. I attached the battery housing to the bottom of the piece. Quick wiring tip for all of you out there. I like to put my flux onto my wires, then build up solder onto the soldering iron. I then simply touch the two together and let the flux suck the solder onto the connection. It's the cleanest and most precise way that I've found to do it. In order to form the curve, I bent the metal around a circular pipe and smoothed it out by hammering it with a mallet. Once the curve was perfect, I was able to toss in some self-tapping screws to secure it. Once all of the electrical was complete, I was very excited because the majority of the work was now behind me and I just got to do the fun parts. After a quick sand touch-up, it was time to paint the base. I wanted to add a little rusty look on all of the bolts and hardware to give it some age and feel. After 22 hours, the cactuses came out great. I like to print directly onto the build plate with my resin prints. I know it's not recommended and it's possible to damage the plate when removing them, but I like how precise it works. And I think the risk is totally worth the reward. After removing the supports, the resin prints get a bath in rubbing alcohol, then a little spin in the UV curing spin cycle. Once the resin prints were dry, I coated them with a vibrant green as a base. Then I used a darker teal to load in the crevices and wiped that away with a dry rag. To contrast this, I dry brushed a yellowish hue on top of the ridges. I then repeated this process for the barrel cactuses. I painted the other 3D bits rusty brown and added some detail in the spray paint can. I want it to look like it's been there for 100 years with the label melted away. Once the barrel cactuses were dry, I decided I needed to go one step further and replicate their insanely spiny, prickly nature. So I dry brushed on some tacky glue, being sure to only coat the exterior ridges. I loaded Woodland Scenic Static Grass Flock into my static grass applicator and shook it gently. This is a pretty cool process, and it uses an electrical current to create static electricity, which lifts the grass up, creating little spikes. Now keep in mind, whenever you use electricity, this can happen.
Wow!
I want the worlds I create to look like they're really inhabited, and I think graffiti and a bunch of debris really sells the effect. Now, I should have added the tags way before I mounted the letters, but what can I do? I referenced a couple of my friends' stickers and printed them out on regular printer paper. I diced them up, slapped them around. I added small rocks and some old rusty cans to the desert landscape. And with that, it was ready to sign. And here's the final. All right, if you're still watching this, either you fell asleep or you liked what you saw. So if you liked what you saw, hit the button, subscribe, flip the switches, do all the doodads. You know what to do. And I just started a Patreon. If you want to throw this old boy a tip, do it there. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. You got a YouTube? Yeah.